And so they should be executed wherever they're found, as part of the fulfillment of divine sunnah, which means that is not the foreign policy of Islam towards mushrikeen. It's actually the policy of Allah towards the rebellious Quraysh, in line with the sunnah of all the other prophets.
Something similar to that is said by, I think, also people like Tariq Swaydan and a few other people who say that the Ridda, they've said the Ridda punishment was there, but in that time only. A few other contemporary. But what is interesting is there's a, I think he lives in America, that Dr. Taha al-Ulwani has written a book on the Ahkam of Ridda. He has a very, and he's got some YouTube videos on it as well, very interesting actually. He speaks about, you see, when Ridda first begins, how Ridda was a strategy. Like if you look at the Quran, Allah is explaining that. Because when a person abandons something, it creates doubt. Like obviously, like let's say you embrace an ideology now, and you're seen as an intelligent person. A week later you leave it. People will think, oh, there must have been something wrong with that, because you know this guy is an intelligent guy. Like why would he leave it? So making reference to the verse in the Quran when like the Yahud say, where they say that let's believe that, you see, we will do this as an attempt to create doubt.
That's right.
So people will think that, oh man, these guys are intelligent people, there must be something wrong with this message. And some people have seen that to counter that strategy, there were threats made. So that's one interpretation.
There's another, I mean, to add to that, I think, so tribal identity was supreme in Arab society, yeah? And Hudaybiyah is a pretty good indication that Muslim identity, first considered the Muslims who were sitting there from different tribes, riffraff, like once the fighting begins, they're not going to be by you because they have no tribal affiliation. And then they come back testifying that so much as he spits and they fight to catch the spit on the ground, right? So they understood that loyalty has now changed. Now the thing is, when you forego your tribal identity in that society, you've declared war against that tribe, right? And if you're fair game. Now the Muslims are in that, the early Ummah is in that ecosystem where your identity is with the people you're affiliated with, and they've got a new, it's not tribal now, it's the Ummah, it's the Shahada. Walking out of that is actually, especially in the middle of what is an ongoing war, is actually a declaration. It is an act of treason. It is, I'm joining the other side. You know, so like, which is very similar to, under peaceful circumstances in international law. Under peaceful circumstances, a Canadian can say, I forgo my Canadian citizenship, I want to become an American, or whatever. But under war, in times of war, foregoing one's citizenship is actually considered an act of treason. You know, and you can, like, even military personnel can forego their citizenship under normal circumstances. But during times of war, that's actually considered treason. This is not something limited to like Islamic Shari'i discourse.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's
like how the world works.
What's still crazy is, as you say, it's still against the grain of the Quran. How many ayat do we have?
And even the ayat interest against that. The ayat, من يرتد منكم عن دينه فسوف يأتي الله بقوم. Not
exactly. This whole thing of Allah has mentioned those people who do this, they are responsible, they're answerable to Allah.
هذه الردة ردة القلب. Oh, Quran, yeah. You're talking about the real deal. Quran was just talking about, you know.
The Quran is there to add dross to Ahad Hadith.
Like, what really irks me, sometimes in Islamic studies discourse, is how Quran is made this tertiary reference that that's not the real conversation. The real conversation is what X, Y, and Z said.
The Quran is like a glossy comment.
No, it is true. So like this verse, like a clear verse, La ikraha fi din. Now think about this is the first masdar of the Sharia.
That's the favorite thing to naskhify, by the way. Right? Anybody have like a naskh allergy? Well, the first thing they go after, La ikraha fi din.
Yeah.
Wal ikrahu fi din.
But and even to say, okay, there's no ikra until you enter it. That's
That's
still
silly.
ikraf.
That's-
It's illogical,
that's
isn't it?
silly.
Like to say that, okay, look, I tell you what, don't worry about it, you can embrace it if you want. Oh, but once you embrace it, you know. And so this is the.
I had an interesting argument with a scholar that shall not be named. وَلِلرِّجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَةٌ.
Okay.
An entire discussion about how men have a degree over women. I was like, actually, Nassan, that doesn't hold.
Okay.
The ayah begins, وَالْمُطَلَّقَاتُ يَتَرَبَّصْنَ بِأَنفُسِهِنَّ فَلَا تَقُولُوا. Okay. يَتَرَبَّصْنَ هُنَّ وَلَا يَحِلُّ لَهُنَّ أَنْ يَكْتُمْنَ مَا خَلَقَ اللَّهُ فِي أَرْحَامِهِنَّ كُنَّ يُؤْمِنَّ بِاللَّهِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ وَبُعُولَتُهُنَّ أَحَقُّ بِرَدِّهِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ إِنْ أَرَادُوا إِصْلَاحًا وَلَهُنَّ مِثْلُ الَّذِي عَلَيْهِنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَلِلرِّجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ 11th pronoun. It's the 11th time they for women is used. Starting with what noun? Al-mutallaqat. Not al-nisa. The entire ayah is a discussion of how women during the iddah period are at a degree of disadvantage. And here's what that looks like. And to take that and then pull from it, وَلِلرِّجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَةٌ, women have a degree less than women, or men. I'm like, I'm at a loss. How did this hunna become nisa and all the other ones are mutallaqat? How did that happen? And then on top of that, there's a taqdeem. لِلرِّجَالِ دَرَجَةٌ is a normal structure. لِلرِّجَالِ دَرَجَةٌ عَلَيْهِنَّ. But there's a taqdeem, making an ikhtisar, خاصة هذه النساء. هؤلاء النساء. عليهن درجة. That's purely textual. You know, but then there's like 30 pages of, well, because they have menses and because their tongue and because of. I'm like, إِنَّا لِلَّهِ وَإِنَّا إِلَيْهِ رَاجِعُونَ. These istidlalat are like, first at least do justice to the primary text before we jump, you know, on like reinforcing our suppositions using like other texts. It's crazy. I thought it was just wild. And then I discussed it and the scholar said, well, that opinion also exists, but the vast majority of what I was like, okay, fine, vast majority. Why have this happened? I just want to know what their thought process was.
And you've got to, you see, this is what I kept saying in that discussion. You've got to understand that people were trying, they may have tried their best for their own age. Like there's an understanding, a global understanding. Like people may have felt at certain times, this is fine, everybody does this. And they reflected, or they understood, let's say from the text, or whatever it is, based on their contextualized understanding. So it's not, so today there is a heightened, I'm not saying that there wasn't, throughout time a voice for human rights and stuff like that, but there is a heightened voice, a cry for things like freedoms. In this day, since this last century, there has been. Now, people, that will have had an effect on people, regardless, it will have an effect on you. And some people, they feel that, because the West have made this cry, we have to be anti it. Like it's somehow, somehow some people feel anything that comes from, let's say, non-Muslims are saying it, that means, this can't be Islam, we've got our own understanding. Like I spoke about human freedoms, human values. Somebody said, are you talking about the ones that the Human Rights Charter has kind of listed? Because in Islam, we've got our own understanding of human rights and human... And okay, maybe on some discussions it'll be interesting to see what they've got to say, but the point is that this methodology of just ruling anything out, that look, al-hikmah, as in the hadith, is dalatul mu'min. It is the property of the believer.
You know what I think about this? I've been thinking about this issue for a while too. What I've arrived at is that, first of all, internally, without even talking about what the West has to say, internally we have a problem. I'll sum the problem up with an example. Why do I make wudu the way I do? I have never looked it up. My dad made it that way. I made it that way. I don't know the adillah for wudu. And the vast majority of the ulama, virtually even the imams of our masajid won't know why the wudu is in the order that it's in. We just do it. We just do the tahiyyat. There's certain assumptions we made that the Islam has a certain baseline you don't question. Certain practices, beliefs, attitudes you don't question. And everything we think about in terms of Islam, we build on top of these presuppositions. a lot of them are just layers and layers. And by the way, لِرِجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَةٌ is one of those presuppositions. Right? That's been well settled into the Ummah for a long time. We're in an age now where the whole concept of أَدْعُوا إِلَى اللَّهِ عَلَى بَصِيرَةٍ, we cannot afford any presuppositions. Like, after 14 years of trying to study Quran, I've arrived at the conclusion that I cannot go into a surah with any presuppositions. I have to leave my assumptions aside and just study the text as genuinely as I can and ask as many critical questions as I can when I come across an interpretation that doesn't seem to add up for this reason, that reason, or the other reason. Like, I need to be able to ask these questions, even if it sounds bad, or you have to be genuine to the text, right? Now, when you do that, you cannot just do that with your own tradition. First of all, we have to start with our own tradition. We have to do this with our own tradition. This is actually genuine scholarship as far as I'm concerned. That's what it always was. People asking the tough questions. But we have to do that with the West too. Not with this reactionary, whatever they have to say is garbage. But you've got two extremes now. You've got the traditionalist who says whatever we have is perfect and not subject to question. And you've got, well, they're onto something. They have pretty good values too. My problem with the Western model of human rights discourse as it is right now is that it shifts every 10 years. The marker shifts. And what is completely unacceptable right now, by their own standards,
will become acceptable.
Will become acceptable and glorified. And it'll change. It'll absolutely change.
Absolutely.
If the 80s were exhaustive discourse about the harms of drugs on your body and mind and the immorality of drug use and things like that, now it's legal in several states and like a human right almost to take marijuana for medical or leisure purposes or whatever, right? Gay marriage just got signed off in the U.S. You guys know about this. Supreme Court signed off on it, right? And you know what the discussion is on Mormon and Orthodox Christian circles? Polygamy is next. Okay. Now we can fight for it. Now it's not immoral because they've opened the door to all kinds of marriage, right? So, because they're saying, well, if that's okay, then this is okay. And then there are other groups that are coming and saying that marrying animals should be okay. Right? Because you open the door. And you know what? It's not entirely far-fetched. What is right now, for example, considered like obscene or indecent exposure to children, right? Because there's an age before which you cannot get married and things like that, right? But now, with the introduction of sexual content or suggestive content to even children, earlier ages. How soon before society decides that we can legalize some of this stuff?
I mean, the morals are always shifting. I think that's undeniable. I think that the angle I meant more, one is okay, let's just say, look, there is a cry in the West for human rights, human values, and let's just embrace that wholeheartedly and just go with their flow. Or one is to understand that, look, use it as a point of reflection. Like to kind of say, well, look, like people are criticizing, like people are saying, okay, there should be freedoms. Like freedom of religion is an example. Now there should be freedoms. Now you look at something rationally. Like we have our own pointers, we have our own. This was another thing. This is why I had said that people throw around these terms nowadays, and I completely. Not only do I dislike these terms, but I believe that they don't even stand within our discourse. They use terms, let's say, liberalism, conservatism. The problem with this is people will use this just to dismiss a point you have to say. I've asked people to define what they mean when they say things like this. Like, when you say, you're just being liberal, what do you mean you're just going being easy? Is that what it means? Just conservative means being harsh. Just because if you look at the hadith says that Aisha said whenever the Prophet faced two issues, he always went with ease. If they say, no, we don't mean by that, we mean holding on to tradition, well, this is tradition. Like, would you say, like people like, this is why I presented, I said, if you take your labels like this and look at Sahaba like Ibn Abbas, with his dissents in things like Riba and so on, and it's known his dissent. The point is, people would just...
I don't know, tell me.
Okay, well, Ibn Abbas, Riba obviously is, it's got many permutations to it, but they look at it briefly. They say that when they're breaking it down, they say there's a riba al-fadl, where you are kind of like kind of like increasing. So I say, you know, like I'll tell you what, give me 2 kilos of dates for 1 kilo of dates, and we swap like that. Or riba nasa, where there's a delay. Like, so I give you something, but I'm going to take something after a while. So there's like a, I don't know if you want to consider a prepaid payment, but especially they make an exception for money and in all other things. So let's say dates once again, as typical examples they used back then. So Ibn Abbas said that there was no riba in fadl, like it was only in nasa. And he disagreed entirely with vast majority of everybody on that.
Give me an example of that.
So he said if somebody was to say, look, here's 1 kilo of wheat, I want 2 kilos of wheat from you.
So 1 kilo.
He said, well, that's fine as long as there isn't a delay. Like if we were transacting here, that would because so this is it. So he says that this is just like in front of you. And la riba. He says, La riba illa fin nasa, that only when there's a delay, it triggers riba. Now, this is an example. Now, that would be considered, I mean, I don't want to sound very controversial, but obviously his disagreement in mut'ah, his disagreement in so many things. For example, in Salah, like...
Oh, you do want to sound controversial. let's start being around that.
Look, I'll tell you something, I'll tell you a really interesting look. And this one is really... In Sahih Muslim, when Ibn Abbas is giving a speech, talking to people, and the time for Maghrib is gone, and somebody gets up and says, Ibn Abbas, the time for Maghrib is gone, what the hell, what are you doing? We should be praying, you should be leading us in Salah. Like, pray Salah, what are you doing? And he just hears him, and then just carries on. And they finish, and he combines the prayers. And he says that the Prophet jama'a min ghayri khawfin wala safar. He says that the Prophet he combined without khawf, when there was no khawf, when there was no safar. And then just in case, some people interpret that this was rain and whatever, but okay, there's a different, but he ends it, he carries on, he says, Arada Allah yuhrija ummata. He wanted his ummah not to be inconvenienced. That meaning, like, this is the student of the Prophet. It's not just anybody, you know. It's not.
You're so liberal.
But by this, but by this standard, people would just say, "Oh, that's pretty liberal." And this is my point. That you see, we don't have that discourse. We have a discourse. We base it on Dalal. Was this the understanding in the Quran? Was it in the Sunnah? Was this what the Sahaba were upon? Do they have this understanding? And they may have had a difference. It's not about just because it sounds easier, let's dismiss it by putting a label on it. Just taking it out just knock it off the table because we just stick a label to it. So this is my point of when I was trying to say that these kind of values today, we look at them, we look at our tradition, we look at the understanding that these people have. Because there may have been some Sahaba who were more, maybe, or some Salaf who may have been slightly more harsh than others. But we have to look at the comprehensive picture. And the most important thing, what did the Quran and Sunnah itself?
But also, one of the things the Quran seems to insist on is that man is this moral being. It's using this idea of...
As with do babies pick it up, or is it pre-wired? And he obviously leads the school on it's pre-wired. So this is the nativist kind of school, as opposed to saying the empiricist school that babies get exposed to language and therefore pick it up. And they've all presented their research, and he's presented some solid, very interesting research on communities that were like migrant different communities. I mean, this is one sample, but I mean, as an example, different communities that live together that made a patched up language to survive, like between themselves. It wasn't a complete, so they would call it a pidgin language. So we just speak, you, go, like these miss out prepositions, miss out. But their children turned it into a Creole. And I think it was in Hawaii or somewhere he uses the case study of, they actually completed the whole structure, and that's an interesting of the inherent ability. And also things like deaf, dumb and blind children and feral children as well, and other things that they've looked at how they've developed language. But the point anyway I'm trying to get at is they speak of that we have this language acquisition device which may be raw. It's not like you're built for Chinese or you're built for English, but there's a universal grammar, like a very raw base structure which you are built for. There's a hardwiring for it, grasp and you absorb language around you. In a similar way, I believe that the thing of kullu mawludin yuladu ala al-fitra is talking about this kind of base. Because the other thing, the general understanding that the ulama have had is that they. And the thing is that, look, this is because the general understanding ulama have is either you have the absolute, let's say traditionally the Maturidiyya, or you might have had the Mu'tazila, or you might have had that you must be able to discern right and wrong all the time. Or tahseen, what they call tahseen or taqbih al-aqli, that you can, by your intellect, just like I can tell lying is wrong, I can tell this. Okay, on some things like murder you can tell, but some things you can't always tell. Okay. And then you have people, traditionally you had the vast majority of muhaddithin, you had the Asha'ira, the understanding was everything is just divine commandment. So there is no good of, so for example, there's nothing wrong with murder, it's just because it's been forbidden, it's now considered qabiyah. So they say, the divine command is X, like is it forbidden, like is it...
This kind of discussion is so distant from the Quranic text.
Yeah, exactly.
Habib al-Qabih.
Yeah, exactly.
Where did he learn that it's wrong? He just felt bad after he did it. It's done. It's inherently in your nature.
Exactly. And this is one of, at a base level, I believe definitely. I mean, not intricacies. I mean, not like, obviously in the Sharia you may have intricacies of, is this permissible, is that permissible? I mean, these are intricacies of law.
Yeah, not law.
But at a base level of morality, yeah.
Sure.
And I was actually, this is what I mean, and I'm really listening to people like Chomsky, or just other, who ain't even, unfortunately, Muslim, but they speak sometimes so much sense, and just listening to different people, just hearing, okay, what do you have to say, and just reflecting on, it's not always about, I think, a sense of sometimes arrogance of thinking, look, somebody isn't a Muslim, we're not going to listen to anything they have to say, we're not going to, that wasn't the message that the Prophet ﷺ brought, it wasn't the message of the Quran, it wasn't the message of the Sunnah, it wasn't even the early Muslim communities. When they embraced, look at the golden era, they embraced foreign knowledge, but then they didn't just blindly embrace it, but they saw all these kind of things like philosophy, and they saw these things, they examined it. They actually became championed it. Things that weren't Islamic, or they felt was a clash, they distanced that from themselves. But they didn't become insecure. See, we have this thing that we become insecure, like, oh, like if you question me about something, oh my God, like, what the, and I think this tying in with our discussion on apostasy is the problem, that people are insecure. When one person questions his faith, it's like, just kill him, or he deserves, whether we kill him or not, he deserves this, because it's a way of consolidating your own faith. Well, really, that should never be the case. Your faith should be built, it should be cemented, it should be solid. It shouldn't be something which kind of depends on the validation of other people.
The other thing that I feel very strongly about is the Quran mostly speaks of other prophets. And it's a very consistent legacy. It's almost as though if each of them are a drop, it forms a river and it flows a certain way, right? And the Prophet ﷺ is supposed to be a culmination and a continuation, really a perfection of that same river. And a lot of this discourse seems to be going upstream, like it contradicts the legacies of prophets, the moral, like the message, the concern for humanity. They didn't come to torture people or kill them, or like, it's not why they were sent.
It's like you see, there's been an immense ritualization of the Deen, which has then unfortunately lost the spirit.
Really.
Yeah,
it's fossilization.
I like that fossilization, because they
somebody
made it so ancient.
Yeah, somebody comes up with a conclusion, then it gets etched in stone. You can't quit questioning that. I don't even like to name certain individual scholars that are landmarks in our history, but if you say something against what X said, you might as well be questioning God himself. So this is what we've done. We've more than popified certain literature in our history, depending on school of thought or line in Aqidah, whatever. I'm free, and scholars are free to disagree with each other. The conversation will continue. I mean, it's fine. Like, it's fine. I started doing student lectures in Arabic.
Okay.
I want to stir the boat a little bit. So, and I decided to start with Baqarah. I did a little bit of Baqarah. And when we got to the story of Adam alayhi salam, which the Baqarah narrative is unique to the rest of the Quran because the إِنِّي جَاعِلٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً أَتَجْعَلُ فِيهَا وَيُفْسِدُ فِيهَا is not anywhere else. That's very unique to the Quran and very unique to the entire story narrative in like even in a biblical sense. What do we know about the angels? Like scripture. We know that لا يعصون الله ما أمرهم وهم بأمره يفعلون ويفعلون ما يؤمرون. So they're in absolute obedience to God. You know, and they're creatures of tasbih, they're creatures of eternal Allah's protection, etc., etc. Okay. So he decides that he's gonna create this Khalifa. And what you get from these angels, who are in absolute obedience to him, is what seems like a very offensive, critical question. Like a humble student, you know, like some teacher comes along and says, I'm going to give him this position. And the humble student gets up and says, you're really going to put him? He's going to be in so much trouble. You're going to make him class monitor? That sounds like disrespect, defiance. It sounds out of line. If this was Pakistan or some madrasa with a sheikh got questioned, you get a jamaat or two, or sort of. You get something, right? And they, by the way, as they say it, they say, well, some people and some have looked at this as we are the alternative. I actually don't look at it that way. And that may be the case, but I actually more see it as we don't mean any disrespect to you or take anything away from you to speak by posing this question. Us not understanding.
That's very, very good.
You know, us not understanding what's going on here and us asking this question in no way takes away from your glory. And we don't mean anything by that. And Allah simply says, and eventually explains it to them. The answer is very elaborate and very well explained. My point was, if angels can question Allah straight, I don't get it. Why are you putting him on the earth? I can see problem 1 and problem 2. يُفْسِدُ فِيهَا يَسْفِكُ الدِّمَاء. Then why can't I question like what's being presented to me? And why is it that once you come into Islam you can't ask questions? There's nobody more in Islam than the carriers of the outcome. than the angels. You know what I'm saying? So I've now decided to kind of, you know, as I talk about Quran, to kind of highlight that actually one of its I'm more convinced of this now than ever before. One of its primary functions is to train the believer how to think. Not just instead of glorifying knowledge, Quran actually glorifies thought. It's not أَفَلَا تَعْلَمُونَ, it's أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ. لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَفَكَّرُونَ يَدَّبَّرُوا آيَاتِهِ. And every time the narrow-minded want to look at these ayat, وَلَا عَقْلَ دُونَ الْعِلْمِ وَهَذِهِ فَضَائِلُ الْعِلْمِ. Okay, yes. Where's fiqh? Where's aql? You know?
No, but things like even look in the Quran, Ibrahim alayhi salam, saying things like, how do you, and this is a messenger, this is a prophet of Allah saying that look, how do you bring the dead back to life? Yeah, I mean, you know, I do believe, it's not that, you see, faith is something else. You know, I want some contentment, you know what I mean? Like
so epic.
Yeah, so it isn't, so this thing of, but it's interesting you mentioned the thing about Adam alayhi salam and the whole, you see, this whole thing stirred a whole other discussion. I don't know if I previously spoke to you about it, but this whole thing of creation before Adam. Right now, you know, we other hominins that are around, the Neanderthals and things like this, and all these other bones that have been found and stuff like this. You know, I've discussed this with people. I've said to people, look, listen, there's actually a very interesting book at the moment by, I think I mentioned it to you last time, that it's by an Egyptian scholar who's passed away, Abdul Sabur Shaheen. It's called Abi Adam wa Qissatul Khaliqa Bain al-Ustura wal Haqiqa. My father Adam, the story of Genesis between fact and fiction. And what he's saying is he's drawing a distinction, and I really like it, between insan and bashar. And he says bashar is the whole hominin, and insan, the first insan was Adam. Now the thing is, and then he brings like, so when Allah says that I'm creating basharan min tin, that a bashar, and using a nakira to show khususiyah, that this is a special, a type of bashar I'm creating. But he has anyway his other dala'i to show this. The point is, I've got into several discussions about this with people. And I've said to people, look, there's only two ways of looking at this. The bonds, the findings, all these things are here. Either we know that Adam alayhi salam was an incredibly intelligent, sophisticated being. He was amazing. I mean, Allah taught him. He was intelligent. So either after him, humanity takes a massive dip, and all these other, these other varying creations existing with slightly different DNA, Neanderthal, whatever, and then later on they re-emerge with intelligence hundreds of thousands of years later, once again or those things precede Adam. And really this is having no bearing in the sense that we're not saying I'm not saying Adam is of him. Adam would be a miracle. But it would not say that the other creation before him defies our understanding in Islam in any way. And I'll tell you, there's an interesting, that the Quran brings this verse. He says that, take a look at this verse. That one, but he brings the verse that where Allah says, وَلَقَدْ خَلَقْنَاكُمْ, that we created you. ثُمَّ, time lapses, صَوَّرْنَاكُمْ, then we gave you formations. ثُمَّ, after, قُلْنَا لِلْمَلَائِكَةِ اسْجُدُوا. He says that yes, people traditionally just said that was creating arwah. But what if khalaqnakum was referring to bashar? And then their formation over time, thumma Adam comes on the scene.
You know what? Was it Shawali Ladhabi for the Qudai Badala? Who argued that arwah of alam al-amr.
Yeah.
And so they're part of good fire, so there's no tadarruj.
There's no, yeah. I mean, that, which to me makes perfect sense.
So khalq and tasweer
That's interesting.
would actually be physical, not be a progressive thing.
That's true. I mean, that makes absolute sense. But I'm just saying that the interesting thing isn't the discourse, which is fascinating, it is very interesting. The interesting thing is the reaction.
I don't think why would this even be controversial?
Oh my god.
You're so kafir.
This was so...
I mean, I don't have a verdict on this either way, to be honest with you.
Right.
Because
People are so intelligent, so